She walked into that crowded dining hall like she owned it. Because she did. Margaret Holloway didn't ask. She never asked. She pointed one lacquered fingernail at Gideon Hale's table. The man sitting alone with his 7-year-old son. The man who had just quietly slid his own bowl of stew across to the boy without saying a single word. And she said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "That table is reserved for people who belong here." The boy looked up. 7 years old, and he already understood what those words meant. Gideon said nothing. He just placed his hand on Owen's shoulder and began to rise. And that was the moment, that exact moment, that changed everything. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated for simply being poor and felt your whole chest go tight with rage and helplessness, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. You will not regret it. And before you go, drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1874 arrived in Red Bluff, Kansas, the way bad news always does, without warning and staying longer than welcome. By July, the sun had baked the main street into something resembling cracked pottery, and the creek that ran behind the livery stable had dropped to a thin brown ribbon that even the horses seemed offended by. Farmers came into town looking hollowed out. Ranch hands spent more time leaning against walls than working. The town's one doctor had left for Wichita 3 months prior and hadn't been replaced. And the Red Bluff Community Dining Hall, a long wooden building that the church had built and the town now ran on donations and sheer stubbornness, had become one of the few places where a working man could get a hot meal for something close to nothing. Gideon Hale had been coming to the dining hall on Thursday evenings for about 6 weeks. He didn't like it. That was the truth of it. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life using his hands, shaping metal, hauling coal, repairing wagon wheels that other men would have declared dead, and accepting charity did not sit well inside his chest. It sat like swallowed gravel. But Owen was 7, and Owen needed food, and Gideon had been awake at 3 in the morning too many times lately doing math in his head that kept coming out wrong. The forge wasn't bringing in what it used to. After the drought ruined 2 harvests in a row, most of the farmers around Red Bluff didn't have extra money for horseshoes. The ranch equipment jobs were fewer. The railroad contract that Gideon had been counting on, that one had fallen through in April when the company decided to reroute the line north of town, and that decision had quietly gutted 3 businesses on Main Street, including his. So, Thursday evenings, the dining hall. 1 bowl of stew each, some bread, a cup of weak coffee for him, and a cup of milk for Owen when they had it. He always arrived exactly at 6 o'clock, right when the line was longest, and nobody paid much attention to individuals. He sat at the table farthest from the door, nearest the back wall, where the light was dim enough that he felt slightly less exposed. Owen sat across from him and swung his legs under the bench because they didn't reach the floor yet, and talked about whatever he'd seen that day. A lizard behind the smithy, a blue-tailed hawk sitting on the water tower, a dog he'd made friends with behind the mercantile. Gideon listened to every word. He was good at that. Listening was one of the things he did well, partly by nature and partly because talking required energy he often didn't have to spare. On the 3rd Thursday of July, the dining hall was more crowded than usual. Something had brought extra people in. Gideon later heard it was a family from out near Hatcher Creek whose wagon had thrown an axle and who were stranded in town while the parts came in. There were also 2 cowboys from a northern outfit passing through, and a handful of men he didn't recognize who had the look of land surveyors about them, with their leather satchels and their clean boots. The stew that evening was thin. Gideon noticed it immediately when he carried their 2 bowls back to the table. Thin and low, which meant the kitchen was running short and stretching what they had. Owen got the first bowl set in front of him, the way it always went, and Gideon sat down with the second. He looked at Owen's bowl. He looked at his own. His was larger. Barely. Maybe half an inch more of stew. A slightly larger piece of carrot floating near the edge. But Owen was growing, and growing boys needed more than thin men who could go another 6 hours on nothing if they had to. He waited until Owen was looking at his milk cup, and then, with the practiced casualness of someone who had done this kind of thing before, Gideon reached across and slid approximately half of his own stew into Owen's bowl. He picked up his bread and took a bite as if nothing had happened, as if he wasn't hungry, as if the small redistribution of a few spoonfuls of beef and potato soup had cost him nothing at all. Owen looked down at his suddenly fuller bowl, then up at his father. "Dad, eat," Gideon said. "You?" "Owen." Not harsh, just final. Owen ate. Gideon watched him and drank his coffee and ate his bread slowly, and if anyone had asked him at that moment whether he was hungry, he would have said no, he was fine, he'd eaten earlier. He would have said it so naturally and with such a settled expression that they probably would have believed him. No one did ask, except that someone had seen. Oh. Vivian Ashcroft had not intended to come to the Red Bluff Community Dining Hall that evening. She had, in fact, come to town for entirely different reasons. A meeting with her late husband's attorney regarding some property near the river, and an errand at the dry goods store that she could have sent her housekeeper for, but had chosen to do herself because she'd been sitting in the Ashcroft house for 4 straight days, and the walls had begun to feel like they were leaning in. The Ashcroft house was the largest private residence in Red Bluff County. 3 stories, 6 bedrooms, a dining room with a chandelier that had been shipped from St. Louis. Harold Ashcroft had built it the year after their marriage, as a demonstration of what he'd made of himself, and Vivian had spent 22 years inside it, trying to feel at home. Harold had been dead for 14 months. She did not miss him the way the town expected her to. She missed certain things: the particular way he laughed at bad weather, the smell of his pipe in the evening, the sound of another person breathing in the house at night. But the marriage had been complicated, the way most long marriages are complicated, and the grief she carried was a mixed and sometimes guilty thing that she had not been able to discuss with anyone in Red Bluff, because there was no one in Red Bluff she trusted with the truth of it. What she had, instead of confidants, was money. Harold had left her substantial holdings, property, investments, a share of 2 businesses in Wichita. She was, by any measure of the frontier, wealthy. She was also 53 years old, in good health, and profoundly, relentlessly lonely in a way that wealth had no mechanism to address. She was walking past the dining hall when she heard it. Not the words at first, just the tone. That particular register that a certain kind of person uses when they want to humiliate someone in public and maintain the fiction that they're simply stating facts. She stopped. Through the open door of the dining hall, she saw a woman standing near the back tables. Margaret Holloway. Vivian knew her. Everyone in Red Bluff knew her. She was the wife of Thomas Holloway, who owned the bank and 3 of the commercial lots on Main Street, and she had the bearing of someone who had confused wealth with moral authority and never looked back. Margaret was pointing at a table. At the table sat a man and a small boy. The man was lean, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the kind of forearms that spoke of years of physical labor. He had a stillness about him. Not the stillness of a man who was comfortable, but the stillness of a man who was choosing very carefully how to respond to something. The boy was looking at Margaret with enormous eyes. "That table," Margaret Holloway said, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room's noise, "is being held for members of the Founders Council Dinner Committee. I'll need you to move." There was no dinner committee meeting scheduled. Vivian knew this because she was, theoretically, a member of it. It met on the first Monday of the month. This was Thursday. The man at the table didn't speak immediately. He looked at Margaret with an expression that Vivian, from the doorway, couldn't fully read, but she could see his jaw tighten, the small muscle flickering under the skin. He placed one hand flat on the table, steadying himself. "We can move," he said. His voice was quiet, even. "Yes," Margaret said. "You can." And then, because one cut was apparently not enough, she added, "There are tables near the door. That's typically more appropriate for walk-ins." Walk-ins. As if a man and his child sitting down to dinner at a public dining hall were somehow transgressing against a private establishment's reservation system. As if poverty were a social offense requiring management. The boy flinched. The man's hand pressed harder against the table, and Vivian Ashcroft walked through the door. She didn't plan what she said. That was the thing she would think about later, lying awake in the Ashcroft house. She hadn't prepared anything, hadn't constructed a speech or weighed her words. She simply walked through the door and opened her mouth, and the words were already there, because some things don't require thought. They only require the decision not to stay quiet. Margaret Holloway turned. Her expression shifted through several calculations in about half a second before settling on something approximating pleasantness. Vivian, what a surprise. There's no committee dinner tonight, Vivian said. She said it simply, not accusatory, just factual, the way you'd correct someone's arithmetic. The next meeting is August 4th. I have it written down if you need to see it. A silence stretched across the nearest tables. Two women nearby had stopped eating. One of the cowboys near the window had turned to look. Margaret's pleasantness developed a hairline crack. I may have gotten the evening confused. These men were here first, Vivian said. She moved toward the table, toward the man and the boy, and pulled out the chair across from the man and sat down, as if the matter were settled. I hope you don't mind if I join you, she said to the man, not to Margaret. I've been on my feet since noon. She set her small bag on the table and looked up at Margaret with an expression that was perfectly polite and utterly immovable. Margaret Holloway looked at Vivian, looked at the table, looked around at the people who were very carefully looking at their bowls or their cups or a point on the wall. Of course, Margaret said, after a pause that lasted precisely long enough to be meaningful. Good evening? She walked away. Vivian exhaled. Across the table, the man was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not gratitude, exactly. Not suspicion. Something more cautious than either. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. The boy, 7, maybe 8, dark eyes that were taking in everything, glanced between them. My name is Vivian Ashcroft, she said. The man was quiet for a moment. Gideon Hale, he said. This is my son, Owen. Hello, Owen. Owen looked at her very seriously. She was lying about the committee dinner, he said. Owen? Gideon started. Yes, Vivian said to Owen. She was. Owen seemed to find this satisfying. He picked up his spoon. Vivian had not intended to stay. She had intended to sit down, let the moment pass, and then excuse herself graciously. That had been the plan. The plan lasted approximately 4 minutes. You're the blacksmith, she said. She'd placed it now. She'd seen him months ago, working outside the forge on the edge of town, the sound of the hammer carrying all the way to the road, on the east side of Prospect Street. Was, Gideon said. Then, catching something in his own word, still am, it's slow. The railroad reroute. He glanced at her. You follow business. Harold, my husband, had interests in the rail contracts. I paid attention because he didn't always. She paused. I'm sorry, the reroute hurt a lot of people who deserved better. Gideon looked at his coffee cup. It is what it is. Dad says that when he doesn't want to talk about something, Owen said informatively. Gideon closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Owen. He does, though. Vivian felt something move in her chest. Not pity, which would have been easier to manage, but something closer to recognition. The particular exhaustion of a person trying very hard to hold several things together at once, and trying even harder not to let anyone see the effort. She'd known that feeling. She'd lived inside it for years, actually, in a different context, in a different kind of house. But the interior architecture of it was the same. How long have you been running the forge? She asked. 11 years, Gideon said. Came to Red Bluff when Owen was born. His mother... He stopped, started again. We came here for a fresh start. The past tense around Owen's mother. Vivian didn't ask. And before that? Before that, I was nobody in particular, he said. Grew up in Missouri. Worked the mines for a while, didn't like it. Found a man in Independence who taught me the trade. He said it all without inflection, not ashamed of it, not proud of it, just honest. The way a person speaks about their life when they've made peace with the fact that it isn't a story they'd choose to perform. What about you? Owen said. He was looking at Vivian with the particular directness of a child who hadn't yet learned that certain questions aren't asked. "Did you always live in the big house?" "Owen," Gideon said, his voice carrying a note of genuine warning this time. "It's fine," Vivian said. She looked at Owen. "No," she said. "I didn't. I grew up on a farm, in Indiana, much smaller than anything in Red Bluff." This appeared to surprise Owen. "Then how did you get the big house?" "I married a man who built one." Owen thought about this. "Do you like it?" And there it was, 7 years old, and he'd walked directly into the center of the thing she spent most of her waking hours carefully not examining. "Some parts of it," she said. Owen seemed to accept this as a complete and truthful answer. He finished the last of his stew and sat back with the particular satisfaction of a child who has eaten enough, which is a kind of satisfaction Vivian had not seen on a person's face in a very long time, and which, for reasons she couldn't have articulated, made her throat tight. Gideon watched his son and said nothing, but his expression in that moment was not the guarded, careful thing it had been. It was something else, something that cost him something to show, even accidentally. Love, she thought. Just plain love. The ordinary, devastating kind. They left the dining hall a little before 7:30. Owen fell asleep almost immediately against Gideon's shoulder as he carried him down the main street toward the edge of town. The boy was substantial. 7 is heavier than it looks. But Gideon carried him without apparent effort, adjusting his grip once, pulling Owen's head more securely against his neck. Vivian walked part of the way beside them, toward the intersection where her carriage waited. They walked mostly in silence, not the uncomfortable kind. "Thank you," Gideon said when they reached the corner. He said it the way a man says thank you when he means it and doesn't want to oversell it. "For earlier, with Margaret. She had no right to speak to you that way." "No," he agreed, "but people with the right aren't usually the ones who do it." She didn't have an answer for that, because it was exactly true. She looked at Owen's sleeping face pressed against his father's collar. One of the boy's hands had found Gideon's shirt and was holding a small fistful of fabric, the way children do when they want to make sure the person carrying them doesn't disappear. "He's going to be all right," she said. She meant it as the general statement it sounded like. That Owen seemed like a sturdy, intelligent child who would grow into something fine. But the moment she said it, she felt that it meant something else too, and that Gideon heard that meaning. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I'm working on it," he said. She nodded. He nodded. He turned and walked down the road toward the east side of town, Owen's hand still clutching his shirt, the two of them becoming a single shape in the evening dark. Vivian stood at the corner for considerably longer than was necessary. She was trying to identify the feeling that had taken up residence in her chest, somewhere between the stew and the walk to the corner. This warm, unnerving, inconvenient feeling that was not romantic in any simple sense, but was something she hadn't felt in years. The feeling of having been genuinely present in a room with another person. Of having exchanged something real. She turned toward her carriage. She told herself she would not think about the Hale Forge again, about the quiet man who slid his food to his son, about the boy who asked her if she liked the big house. She told herself this very firmly. She didn't believe herself for a second. In the Ashcroft house that night, she sat at the desk in the study where Harold had kept his accounts and pulled out the ledger she used for her own records. She told herself she was reviewing the property documents from the attorney meeting. She reviewed 2 pages. Then she sat for a long time with her pen in her hand, not writing anything. People with the right aren't usually the ones who do it. She thought about the railroad reroute and who had known about it in advance and who had quietly profited from the rerouting decision. She thought about Harold's meetings in the spring of 1873, the ones he'd had with Thomas Holloway's people, the ones he'd told her were routine. She thought about the forge on Prospect Street standing quieter than it should be. She set the pen down. In the morning, she would go back to her ordinary life. The attorney meetings and the household accounts, and the invitations to things she didn't particularly want to attend. She would be Vivian Ashcroft, the widow, the woman with the 3-story house and the St. Louis chandelier. But something had shifted, something that small, quiet dinner at a back table in a crowded room had moved. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the kind of patient, irreversible certainty of a river changing its course. She picked up the pen again. At the top of a clean page, she wrote a single name, Gideon Hale. Below it, a question she didn't yet know how to answer. What do I actually know about this man? She closed the ledger. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous, and the stars were very bright. And somewhere on the east side of town, a man was sleeping in a chair beside his son's bed. Because that's what fathers do, and the world was quietly rearranging itself around a kindness that had already been paid and not yet recognized. She didn't go back the next Thursday. She told herself it was because she had a prior engagement, a dinner with Eleanor Marsh, whose husband had been Harold's attorney and who had been gently persistent about Vivian socializing more. She told herself this was the reason, and it was partly true. Eleanor's dinner was real, and Vivian did attend it and sat through 2 hours of conversation about other people's gardens and a protracted debate about whether the new minister's wife was appropriately humble, and she smiled and nodded and ate the roasted chicken and thought about almost none of it. What she thought about, in the spaces between responses, was a question Owen Hale had asked her. Do you like it? The big house. Do you like it? Nobody had asked her that in 22 years of living in it. Not Harold, not the women who came for dinner parties, not the housekeeper who'd worked there for 15 years. It had not occurred to anyone that the question was available to be asked, because the answer was presumed to be obvious. You had a 3-story house with a chandelier from St. Louis. Of course you liked it. The liking was built into the having. A 7-year-old with stew on his chin had looked at her across a table and asked the question with no agenda at all, just genuine curiosity, the way children ask questions before they learn which ones are impolite. She drove home from Eleanor's in the dark and sat in the Ashcroft house parlor for a long time without lighting the lamp. The week after that, she went to the forge. She told herself she was going because she needed the wheel rim on her smaller carriage repaired, which was true. There was a crack in it that the liveryman had flagged 2 weeks prior. She told herself this was a practical errand, nothing more. She prepared this explanation on the drive over, rehearsing the exact ordinary tone with which she would deliver it, as if tone could make the visit more casual than it was. She turned onto Prospect Street and pulled up to the forge, and the explanation dissolved before she ever used it. The forge was quieter than a working smithy should be on a Tuesday morning. The doors were open, wide double doors, weathered to silver gray, and she could hear the fire, the low breathing of it, but no hammer. She stepped down from the carriage and walked to the doorway. Gideon was inside, bent over a workbench, not at the anvil. He was looking at something spread out in front of him. Papers, it looked like, several of them. And he had the expression of a man working a math problem that kept producing an answer he didn't want. He heard her step and looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said. He straightened, set a hand on the papers almost reflexively, the way you cover something before you've decided whether to cover it. I wasn't expecting anyone. I have a cracked wheel rim, she said. The practical errand, right on schedule. He looked at the carriage behind her. I can look at it. I also came to see how you were. He looked back at her. A beat. I'm all right. Owen? He's at the schoolhouse. Something relaxed fractionally in his face at the mention of the boy. Not a smile, not quite, but the specific easing of a person whose main concern has been briefly confirmed as okay. He goes most days, when I can get him there. Vivian stepped further into the doorway, not quite inside. The forge was hot and smelled of iron and coal and something else underneath. Sawdust, maybe, or the particular dry smell of old wood. The walls had tools hung on them in arrangements that were clearly logical even if she couldn't read the logic. Everything was worn but organized. What are those? She asked, nodding toward the papers on the bench. He didn't answer immediately. His hand was still resting on them. Accounts, he said finally. Yours? Old ones. He paused. I've been going through some old business records that I found in a box. They came with the property when I bought this land. Previous owner left a crate of things in the back room. Vivian went still. Harold Ashcroft's previous owner? She said carefully. Gideon's expression shifted into something she couldn't read. Before that, he said, older than Harold, man named Wheeler. He had a dry goods operation here before the Ashcroft interests moved in. He said it without emphasis, without accusation, just fact. But the mention of Harold's name, the way it had almost come out of his mouth before he caught it, sat in the air between them like a sound that hadn't quite finished echoing. May I see them? She said. Another pause. Longer this time. He looked at the papers, then at her, and she could see him making a calculation that had nothing to do with arithmetic. Yes, he said. She stepped inside. The papers were a mix. Invoices, letters, what looked like partial ledger pages. Most of them related to Wheeler's operation, deliveries of flour and tobacco and hardware, correspondence with suppliers in Kansas City. But near the bottom of what Gideon had spread out, half covered by a ledger page, was something different. A receipt. Handwritten, faded to pale brown at the edges. Dated October 1861, the handwriting at the top was unfamiliar, cramped, slanting, the hand of someone who hadn't had much schooling. But at the bottom, 2 sets of initials. W.B. on the left. On the right, in a cleaner hand that Vivian recognized with a jolt that traveled from her sternum to her fingertips. E.C. Eleanor Croft. Her father's initials before he changed the name, before he moved the family from Ohio to Indiana and started over and became Edmund Croft instead of the longer, more complicated name he'd been born with. He'd done it in 1858. Nobody in Red Bluff knew this. Nobody in Red Bluff had known her father at all. She picked up the receipt with both hands. It was a record of debt forgiven. A loan, or what had functioned as a loan. A sum of money that would have been significant to a working man in 1861, but that wasn't, by itself, what arrested her attention. What arrested her attention was the notation at the bottom, in a third hand, smaller and more careful than either of the others. Paid in full, with gratitude. May this find its way back to those who need it. G.H. She stood there reading those words 3 times. G.H., she said. Gideon had been watching her. She could feel it without looking up. Gideon, she said. Hail. The forge fire breathed. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted its weight and its tack clinked. How old were you? She said, and her voice was not entirely steady. In 1861? He was quiet for a moment. 14, he said. She looked up. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not leaning on anything, not moving. His face was doing something difficult, working through something that had clearly been unresolved for a long time. Where were you in 1861? She asked. Indiana, he said, just outside of Harlow County. Harlow County. Her father's farm. The one they'd nearly lost in the fire of 1860 that took the barn and the winter stores and a good portion of the east field and had left Edmund Croft sitting at the kitchen table in November with his head in his hands while Vivian, who was 11 years old, watched from the doorway and didn't know what to do. You were an orphan, she said. It wasn't a question. It was the piece clicking into place. My mother died in '59, he said. I was working my way across Indiana doing odd jobs. Farm work mostly. Whatever people would pay for. My father gave you bread, she said. She said it before she fully understood that she was going to say it. It came from somewhere below conscious thought, from the place where half-remembered stories live, the things a parent tells a child not as a lesson, but as an offhand moment, a footnote in a larger accounting of an ordinary day. She remembered it now. Her father, at supper, some evening in that terrible winter after the fire. We had a boy come through today, nothing to him, starving. Your mother gave him the bread from this morning, and Vivian had been 11 and more concerned with her own hunger that winter and had not asked what happened to the boy and had not thought about him again for 40 years. Gideon was looking at her. He didn't just give me bread, he said. His voice had dropped, not emotional exactly, but careful, like a man carrying something breakable. He let me sleep in the remaining barn that night, and the next 2. And his wife, your mother, she packed a cloth with cornbread and dried meat and gave it to me when I left. He stopped. I didn't know who they were. Not really. Just a farm family in Harlow County who treated me like I was worth something when I had nothing to recommend me. Vivian had to set the receipt back down because her hands weren't reliable. How did you find out whose farm it was? She said. I didn't. Not then. He moved toward the bench, not to take the receipt back, just to stand closer to it, closer to the conversation. I found out 12 years later, when I was working in a rail camp in Missouri and met a man who'd done business with your father's property after it sold. He had your father's name on a document, Edmund Croft, and something about the description, the location, the county, I knew. And the money, Vivian said, the sum on the receipt. Where did that come from? Something passed over his face, not pride, which would have been easier, more complicated than that. I had a good 2 years in 71 and 72. Rail work, some contract jobs. I had more than I needed for the first time in my life. He looked at the receipt. I knew your father had sold the Indiana property and moved on. I couldn't find him directly, but I found Wheeler, who had dealt with him in Kansas, and I asked him to pass it along to the family. I paid him to do it. Wheeler never passed it along, Vivian said. Clearly not, Gideon said. Dry. But not bitter, just resigned, the way a man is resigned to something he already knew about human nature. That money... She stopped. Started again. My father died in 1869. He died thinking the farm debt had broken him. He died thinking... She stopped again. I'm sorry, Gideon said, simple and direct. He would have wanted to know, she said, that it was paid back. He would have... She pressed her lips together, blinked twice. She was not going to weep in this man's forge over a debt from 1861. She was not. He would have been glad to know it. Gideon didn't say anything. He had the good sense not to rush the moment with words. After a minute, she picked the receipt back up and looked at the initials again. EC and WB, and at the bottom, GH, with that quiet notation. May this find its way back to those who need it. You wrote this yourself, she said. I wrote the bottom part, he said. Wheeler wrote the rest. May this find its way back to those who need it. She read it aloud quietly. That's an unusual thing to write on a receipt. He was quiet for a moment. I had more money than I'd ever had, and I knew it was temporary. Which it was. He looked at the forge fire. The crash came the year after. Lost the rail contracts, lost most of what I'd saved, came to Red Bluff to start fresh. He paused. Again. The word again did something. It was the kind of word that accumulates weight over a lifetime of using it, and she could hear the accumulation in how he said it. You've been starting fresh quite a lot, she said. Seems to be my pattern. And Owen's mother? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Clara, he said. She was from here, actually, from Red Bluff. We met when I first came out. She was smart, and she laughed easily, and she had no patience for nonsense, which I appreciated. He stopped. She died in the winter of 72, fever. Owen was 5. I'm sorry, Vivian said. She would have hated people feeling sorry for her, he said. So I try to do it quickly and move on. Vivian almost smiled. Almost. And what about you? She said. Feeling sorry for yourself? He looked at her, slightly surprised. Do you do that? She said. Or do you just get up and start again? I do a little of both, he said after a moment. Mostly late at night when there's nobody around to see it. It was probably the most honest thing he'd said since she walked in, and it landed with a weight that she recognized because she did exactly the same thing, in exactly that timing, in the dark of the Ashcroft house when the rooms were quiet and there was no performance required. Me too, she said. Gotcha. She stayed another hour. She didn't plan to. The wheel rim, which Gideon looked at and confirmed needed straightening, a 30-minute job, extended into something else, a continuation of the conversation at the bench, circling back through the receipt and the years and the geography of how two people's lives can intersect without their knowledge, twice, across decades and miles. She told him about her father, about the fire of 1860 and the winter that followed, and the particular kind of shame that comes from being a proud man made suddenly helpless. She'd seen it in her father's face, and she'd seen it, she said last Thursday in the dining hall. That same particular shame. Gideon listened the way he listened, which was completely. I wasn't ashamed, he said when she finished, not of being poor, just of Owen seeing it. You slid your food into his bowl. He went still, just slightly, a fraction of a stillness. I saw, she said, not unkindly. He looked at the bench. He's growing, he said. He needs it more than I do. I know. She paused. I'm not saying it as a criticism. I'm saying it because it's the first thing I noticed about you. Before Margaret, before any of that. I saw you give him your stew and pretend you weren't hungry, and I thought... She stopped. What? He said. She looked for the honest word. I thought, that man is spending everything he has on that boy, and he'd rather go hungry than let the boy know. Gideon didn't answer. His jaw did the thing again, the small tightening she'd noticed at the dining hall. Is that embarrassing? She said. It's private, he said. Or it was. I'm sorry I watched. You can't help what you see, he said. Then, after a beat, I'm not sure I mind. Now was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly. She left when the wheel rim was finished. He helped her back up to the carriage, not elaborately, just a steadying hand that was there and then wasn't, and she turned the horses toward town. Halfway down Prospect Street, she realized she was gripping the reins harder than she needed to. She loosened her hands, breathed. The receipt was in her coat pocket. She'd asked if she could take it, and he'd said yes without hesitation, as if it had always been hers to have, which in a way it had. Red Bluff was the kind of small town that noticed things. By the following week, 3 different women had mentioned to Vivian, in 3 different contexts with 3 different degrees of subtlety, that she'd been seen on Prospect Street. One of them was Eleanor Marsh, who brought it up during a Wednesday afternoon visit over tea, in the gentle probing manner of a woman who considers herself a friend. I heard you took the carriage to the forge, Eleanor said. Cracked wheel rim, Vivian said. Ah, a pause, timed with precision. Gideon Hale's forge. It's the only forge in town, Eleanor. Of course. Another pause. He's a nice enough man, from what people say. Keeps to himself. A third pause, which was where the actual content lived. People do notice, Vivian, given your position. Vivian set her tea down. What do they notice? She said. Just... Eleanor adjusted her cup. People talk, they wonder. A woman in your situation, my situation, Vivian said. Your standing, your circumstances. Eleanor looked uncomfortable, which was rare for her. It's not me saying it, Vivian. You know how this town is. I know exactly how this town is, Vivian said. I've lived in it for 22 years. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Are you all right? I'm better than I've been in some time, actually, Vivian said. And she picked up her tea and moved the conversation onto other ground with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades managing social situations. And Eleanor let her, because Eleanor was smart enough to know when a door had been closed. But the conversation stayed with Vivian after she walked home. Not because Eleanor was wrong. The town did notice, and the town's notice had consequences, and Vivian wasn't naive about that. What stayed with her was the phrase, a woman in your situation. Her situation, 53 years old, widowed, wealthy, no children, property and investments, and a house with a chandelier that no one in Red Bluff County had thought to ask her whether she liked. And now a forge visit and a receipt and a conversation that had turned over more soil than she'd anticipated, and a man who said, with total plainness, I do a little of both, mostly late at night when there's nobody around to see it. She sat down at the study desk that evening and looked at the receipt again. May this find its way back to those who need it. She thought about need, what she needed, what she had that wasn't need but its opposite, this vast drafty surplus of things that didn't add up to warmth. Then she pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began to write down what she knew. What she knew was this. The money Gideon had sent through Wheeler in 1872 had never reached her father. Edmund Croft had died in 1869, which Gideon hadn't known until today. So in point of fact, the money had been sent to a dead man's estate. Wheeler, rather than returning it or passing it to the family, had simply kept it. Wheeler had left Red Bluff in 1873, destination unknown. The money was not coming back. That chapter was closed. But the debt, the original one, the one that wasn't about money at all, the one that started with bread and a barn floor in Indiana in the worst winter of her father's life, that was something else. That wasn't an account that could be settled with a receipt. She wrote Gideon's name at the top of the page again. Below it this time, she didn't write a question. She wrote, "What would Edmund Croft want me to do?" She stared at that for a while. Then she put the pen down and went to bed, and lay awake for a long time in the Ashcroft house that she didn't particularly like, listening to the enormous Kansas night outside the window and thinking about a 14-year-old boy who had slept in a stranger's barn and been given bread and had carried that small kindness forward for 22 years and tried to repay it when he could, and then lost everything again and come to Red Bluff and built a forge and raised a son and given his stew away and said, "I'm all right," when he very clearly wasn't. She thought about Thomas Holloway and the railroad reroute and the meetings Harold had attended and the careful, profitable decisions that men with power make when they're sure no one else is keeping track. She thought about the question she hadn't asked yet but was going to have to ask. She thought about what it meant that the man who had secretly tried to honor her family's kindness was now the man being pushed out of a dining hall and squeezed out of his livelihood while Thomas Holloway's bank held the commercial future of Red Bluff in its fist. She thought about all of this until nearly 2 a.m. Then she got up, went back to the study, and wrote a letter to her attorney in Wichita. She asked him to find out everything he could about the railroad reroute decision, who had prior knowledge of it, and which property transactions had occurred in Red Bluff County in the 6 months before and after the announcement. She sealed the letter. She would not tell Gideon what she was doing, not yet, because she didn't know yet what she would find, and because Gideon Hale was a man who managed things by himself and would not thank her for involving herself in his affairs without being asked, and she respected that even though it cost her something to respect it. What she knew, what she was certain of, in the way you're certain of the things that reside below argument, was that something had been taken from him. Not just the railroad contracts, something more structural than that. Something that had been arranged by people who had the information and the connections and the moral flexibility to use both. And she was going to find out exactly what it was. Edmund Croft would have wanted that. She was sure of it. She went back to bed. In the morning, she had the letter sent, and then she went about her day with the particular quiet focus of a woman who has finally, after a long time of drifting, located the thing she is supposed to be doing. The attorney's letter came back from Wichita in 11 days. Vivian read it twice at the study desk, then folded it and sat for a long time with her hands flat on top of it, pressing it against the wood as if it might otherwise fly apart. What her attorney had found was not, in itself, surprising. Vivian had suspected the shape of it, but suspicion is a different animal from confirmation, and confirmation arrived with a weight that suspicion never quite carries. The weight settled into her chest and stayed there. The railroad reroute decision had been finalized in February of 1873. The official announcement came in April. In the 6 weeks between, 6 weeks during which the information existed inside a very small circle of men who had business interests and the right connections, 4 parcels of land along the new northern route had changed hands. All 4 transactions had been processed through Holloway Bank. 2 of the buyers were companies Vivian's attorney had traced, through several layers of paperwork, back to Thomas Holloway himself. Harold's name did not appear in any of the documents. That absence told her almost as much as a presence would have. Harold had known. She was certain of it. The spring meetings, the careful way he'd deflected her questions about the rail contract, the particular quality of his silence in those months. Harold had known and had chosen not to act, which was its own kind of complicity, but also meant that whatever he'd told himself to justify it, he hadn't been willing to go all the way in. Thomas Holloway had gone all the way in, and in doing so, he had rerouted the line away from Red Bluff's east side, away from the Forge District, away from the working quarter of town, and the businesses that depended on that traffic had dried up one by one, quietly, the way things die when the water is slowly redirected away from them. She wrote back to her attorney with 3 more questions. Then she did the thing she'd been doing more often lately. She went to the forge. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning, and Gideon was working. Actually working. She could hear the hammer before she reached the door, the rhythmic report of iron on iron, and when she stepped into the doorway, she saw him at the anvil with a length of heated metal, turning and striking with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this particular thing 10,000 times. He didn't look up immediately, and she didn't announce herself. She watched him work for about 30 seconds before he sensed her there and stopped. He looked over his shoulder. His face was streaked with soot and sweat. He was wearing a leather apron that had seen better years. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "You can call me Vivian," she said. She'd said this before. He'd nodded and then continued calling her Mrs. Ashcroft. He set the metal back in the fire and pulled the apron back. "What's happened?" he said, because apparently he could read the particular quality of her stillness. "I've been looking into the railroad reroute," she said. He went very still. "I asked my attorney in Wichita to pull the land transaction records from early 1873, she said. Before the announcement. He turned to face her fully. The hammer was still in his hand, not threateningly, just forgotten. "Vivian," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name without being prompted, and neither of them noted it, which said something. "What did you find?" She told him. All of it. The 6-week window, the 4 land parcels, the Holloway bank transactions, the shell companies pointing back to Thomas Holloway. She told him plainly, without softening it, because he was not a man who benefited from softened things. He listened without interrupting. The muscle in his jaw did its thing. He set the hammer down on the anvil with a controlled, deliberate movement. When she finished, the forge fire breathed, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I knew something was wrong with it," he said. His voice was even, too even. The kind of even you manufacture when what's underneath it is something you can't afford to let out in front of another person. The reroute didn't make geographical sense. The northern route is longer and the grade is worse through the Calder Creek section. Nobody routes a line that way unless there's another reason. "The reason was 40 acres of Holloway land along the new route," Vivian said, "which is now worth 4 times what he paid for it." "And the businesses that died," Gideon said. "Yes." "And the families that left." "Yes." He turned away from her and looked at the fire. She could see the back of his neck, the tension in it. "Can it be proven?" he said. "Legally, in a way that matters." "My attorney thinks possibly yes," she said. "It depends on whether we can establish that Holloway received the reroute information before it was public, and through what channel." "Harold?" She stopped. "My late husband attended meetings with Holloway's people in that window. I can't prove what was said, but the timing is documented." Gideon turned back. His expression had settled into something that wasn't anger exactly, but was related to it. The compressed version of anger that a person carries when they've been carrying it long enough that it becomes structural. "You shouldn't be involved in this," he said. "Holloway has reach in this county. If he finds out you're looking into him, he'll do what?" she said. "Rescind my invitation to Margaret's dinners?" "He could make things difficult for you, business things, property things." His voice had a careful warning quality. "Harold's estate is still being settled, isn't it?" "For another 2 years, approximately." She met his eyes. "I'm aware of the risks, Gideon. I chose to look into it anyway." "Why?" It was a direct question, and he asked it directly, looking at her without flinching, and she could either give him the partial answer or the true one. "Because somebody should have looked into it 2 years ago," she said. "And because—" She stopped, then pushed through the stop. "Because what he took from you was taken on a lie. And I have the means to try to correct that, and my father would have used those means, and I'm going to." Gideon looked at her for a long time. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully name, something between gratitude and resistance, and something else underneath both of those, something more personal and less manageable. "All right," he said finally. "Not thank you, not you didn't have to, just all right." And somehow that was more honest than either of those would have been. She left when Owen came back from the schoolhouse at noon, running in through the forge door with the particular full-body energy of a 7-year-old who has been sitting still for 4 hours and is done with it. He stopped when he saw Vivian, and his face lit up in a way that was slightly harder to look at than she expected. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, as if her presence here was not at all surprising. "Did you see the hawk again? There's a hawk that lives in the cottonwood by the creek, and I've been watching it every morning before school." "I haven't seen it yet," she said. "I'll show you sometime," he said, with the total confidence of someone for whom this was obviously a good plan. Then he went to the water bucket and drank with the ungoverned thirst of a child, and Vivian watched him and felt the now familiar pressure behind her eyes that she was managing better, barely, than she had been. She said goodbye and drove back to town. The receipt was still in her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, which she hadn't admitted to herself until just now. The gossip arrived before August did. It came in the form of a comment made at the Founders Council monthly meeting, the August 4th one, the real one, when a woman named Frances Pruitt, who was 60 years old and had the moral courage of someone much younger when deployed in the service of social management, said within Vivian's earshot that she hoped certain members of the community were mindful of the example they set, given their position. The comment was directed at no one in particular. It was addressed to the middle distance. Frances Pruitt had mastered the art of the remark that deniably wasn't about anyone. Vivian let it sit in the air for exactly 5 seconds. Then she said pleasantly, "Frances, if you have something to say to me directly, I'm right here." Frances Pruitt blinked. This was not the expected response. "I wasn't speaking of anyone in particular," Frances said. "No," Vivian said. "You weren't." And she returned to her conversation with the woman on her left, and the exchange was over, and Frances Pruitt spent the rest of the meeting looking as though she'd swallowed something sideways. Margaret Holloway, sitting across the table, had watched this entire exchange with an expression that Vivian couldn't quite read. Not the usual satisfaction Margaret wore when social order was maintained. Something more considered than that, more watchful. Vivian didn't like that watchfulness. She mentioned it to Gideon 3 days later. Not as alarm, just as information. "Margaret Holloway was looking at me in a way I didn't like at the council meeting," she said. They were sitting on the bench outside the forge, which had become a thing that happened. She came, they talked, sometimes outside when the late afternoon cooled the air enough. It had developed its own rhythm without either of them formally establishing one. "What kind of looking?" he said. "The kind where someone is deciding something," she said. He was quiet. He was carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife. Something he did when he was thinking, she'd noticed. Just moving the blade through the grain, not making anything particular. "If Holloway knows you're looking into the reroute," he said, "Margaret will know." "Thomas and Margaret share everything?" she said, slightly skeptical. "Thomas and Margaret share everything that pertains to controlling Red Bluff," he said. "They've been doing it for 15 years. She handles the social side and he handles the money side, and between them they've got the county managed the way a man manages a card game he's marked the deck for." She sat with that. "You've thought about this." "I've had time," he said. "Slow business gives you a lot of time to think." He turned the wood over in his hand. "I should tell you something." The shift in his tone was slight, but she caught it. "3 months ago," he said, "before you came to the dining hall, I went to Holloway's bank to ask about restructuring the forged loan. The original loan was with Fletcher's Bank, which Holloway bought out 2 years ago. So now Holloway holds my note." She went still. "And?" "He gave me a meeting, very polite about it." He ran his thumb along the carved edge. "He said he'd be happy to discuss restructuring. And then he said that what would really help, what would make the bank very comfortable, would be if I moved the forge to the north end of town, sold the Prospect Street property." "To whom?" she said, though she already knew the shape of the answer. "He had a buyer in mind," Gideon said. "Didn't name him, but he had a buyer in mind." Vivian's hands were folded in her lap. She pressed them together harder. "He wants the Prospect Street land," she said. "I suspect so." He set the carving down. "I said I'd think about it. I've been thinking about it ever since, which mostly means lying awake doing the math and coming up with the same answer, which is that if I move the forge, it loses its location value, and I can't afford the North End property anyway, so I'd be selling him one thing and losing two." "And the loan?" "Comes due in 14 months, he said. "If business doesn't improve—" He stopped. "It's a short conversation." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has stared at a problem long enough that it has stopped looking like a problem and started looking like weather, something you endure rather than solve. "I'm going to talk to my attorney again," she said. "Vivian, he's squeezing you," she said. "That's what this is. He rerouted the line to kill the east side, and now he's waiting for the properties to fail so he can buy them at collapse prices. Yours is probably the third or fourth he's identified." She could hear her own voice, and it was more heated than she intended. She brought it back down. "I'm going to talk to my attorney." He looked at her. Not resistant this time. Tired, maybe. The specific tiredness of a man who has been fighting alone for long enough that the offer of company is both relief and complication. "What does that cost you?" he said. Quiet. Direct. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're spending money and time, and now you're in Holloway's sightline," he said. "And He stopped. "I'm a blacksmith with a failing forge and a loan coming due and a 7-year-old. What does it cost you to keep pulling at this thread?" She understood what he was really asking. It wasn't about money. "Less than it would cost me to stop," she said. He held her gaze. Then he nodded once, looked back at the middle distance, and picked up the carving again. They sat there for another 20 minutes, not talking much, and the afternoon light moved across the dust of Prospect Street, and somewhere in the cottonwood by the creek, which she could just see from where she sat, a hawk was probably going about its indifferent business. And this, the bench, the carved wood, the quiet, felt more like being alive than she'd felt in a long time, and she was aware of that, and it complicated everything. Owen got sick on a Tuesday at the end of August. It started as what it always starts as, a heaviness, a warmth in the skin, the particular slack quality a child gets when something internal is pulling their energy downward. Gideon noticed it at breakfast and thought, children get fevers. Children fight through fevers. He sent Owen to school anyway, which he would spend time feeling guilty about later. By 2 in the afternoon, the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Pratt, had sent a message to the forge. The boy had gotten worse through the morning. He was flushed and his eyes were glassy, and he said his head hurt. Gideon was at the school in 15 minutes. Owen was sitting in the back of the classroom when he arrived, in a chair near the window, with the faintly bewildered expression of a child who doesn't understand yet that they're ill, just that everything feels wrong. His skin, when Gideon put a hand to his forehead, was dry and hot, in a way that was different from ordinary fever. Different enough that something in Gideon's chest tightened. "Hey, bud, he said, crouching in front of him. "I don't feel good," Owen said. His voice was smaller than usual. "I know." He picked him up. Owen put his head against Gideon's shoulder and didn't talk, which was the thing that worried Gideon more than the fever itself. Owen always talked. He carried him home to the small house beside the forge and put him in bed and got water and got a cloth for his forehead and did all the things you do, the practical things, because doing the practical things keeps the fear at a manageable distance. He sat beside the bed and watched Owen sleep and listened to his breathing, which was too fast. He thought about Dr. Mercer, who had left for Wichita in May and not been replaced. He thought about the woman who sometimes did medicine on the south end of town, a widow named Mrs. Dalt, who knew herbs and had helped with Owen's ear infection 2 winters ago. He thought about the distance to the next town and what his horse could do at a run. He was still sitting there thinking through options and not liking any of them when he heard the knock at the house door. Vivian was on the step with a basket. He stared at her for a moment. "I came by to bring Owen those pine nuts he mentioned last week," she said, then looked at Gideon's face. "What's wrong?" Not a question. She read him that fast. "He has a fever," Gideon said. It's worse than a regular fever. I can't tell." He stopped because the uncertainty in his voice was more audible than he intended, and he didn't like it. She was inside before he'd finished the sentence. She went directly to Owen's room and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand to his forehead, and then his cheek, and then she turned back to Gideon. "How long?" she said. "Started this morning. Maybe earlier, and I missed it." She looked at Owen again, his breathing, the color of his face, which was wrong, too flushed in some places and too pale in others, a modeling that Vivian recognized from a long way back, from a summer in Indiana when she was 12, and her younger brother had looked exactly like that, and her mother had sat up for 4 nights and wept on the 5th one. "There's a doctor in Selena," she said. "Dr. Albert Reeves. He's good. I know him, but he attended Harold in his last illness." "Selena is 40 miles, Gideon said. "I know how far Selena is." She stood. "My driver can make it in 6 hours. I'll send him tonight and have Dr. Reeves here by morning." "Vivian, don't," she said, not harsh, just firm. "Don't tell me you can manage it. Don't tell me you'll figure something out." She looked at him, and the look was not unkind, but it had no softness to spare. "Let me do this." He looked at Owen. Owen's eyelashes were wet. At some point in the last half hour, he'd started sweating, which could be good, breaking fever, sham, or could be the body failing to maintain something it needed to maintain. Gideon had no way to know which one. "All right," he said, the same 2 words he'd said in the forge about the railroad investigation. Different weight this time, much heavier. She sent her driver. Then she sent her housekeeper to fetch Mrs. Dalt, the herb woman, for the overnight. Then she sent a second message to Selena, to the pharmacist she'd dealt with on Harold's behalf, asking him to gather what he could for fever, for whatever the presentation suggested. She did all of this from the Hale front room, writing quickly on paper she borrowed from Gideon's cabinet, while he sat in Owen's doorway because he couldn't stand to be farther away and couldn't stand to hover over the boy either. "You're very organized," he said when she came back to where he stood. "I have been useless enough times in my life to appreciate being useful when I can," she said. Mrs. Dalt arrived within the hour. A small, capable woman in her 60s who looked at Owen with the eyes of someone who had seen this many times and took the measure of it without flinching. She made a tea from willow bark and something dried that she had in a cloth pouch, and got enough of it into Owen to make a dent. She said the sweating was good, that it meant the body was working, but that he needed a real doctor by morning. "There's something going around," Mrs. Dalt said quietly to Vivian, in the front room, while Gideon was with Owen. "I've seen 3 others this week. It starts the same way." "What is it?" Vivian said. "Don't know for certain," Mrs. Dalt said. "Could be typhoid, could be something like it." The word sat in Vivian's chest like a stone. "He'll be all right," Mrs. Dalt said. Not as reassurance. She wasn't a reassurance kind of woman, more as assessment. "He's young and he's strong, but he needs medicine I can't make." Vivian nodded. She went back to Owen's room. Gideon was sitting on the chair beside the bed with his elbows on his knees, bent forward, watching Owen. He didn't look up when she came in. She sat on the edge of the bed again and put her hand on Owen's forehead. Cooler, marginally. The tea was working. "He's a little cooler," she said quietly. Gideon exhaled. "Yeah." Didn't move. "He's all I have," he said, barely above a murmur. Not to her exactly. Just a thing that came out. She didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. It was true, and it was terrifying, and those 2 qualities sometimes just have to sit in a room together without being managed. After a while, Gideon said, still quietly, his mother used to sing to him when he couldn't sleep. This ridiculous song she made up about a frog who wanted to be a horse. He stopped. He asked me to sing it to him once after she died, and I couldn't remember all the words. I remembered the first part, and then I made sounds that were in roughly the right direction. "Did he notice?" Vivian said. "He told me I'd got it wrong," he said, "but he fell asleep anyway." She almost smiled. Didn't. "He knows you're here," she said. "Kids know." "I know he knows." He finally sat back in the chair, tiredness moving through him visibly, the way water moves into sand. "That's the part that gets me. He always knows where I am. Every room, He always has one ear out." He looked at Owen's face, slack in sleep. "I can't disappear on him. That's all I think about. I cannot be the person who disappears." She looked at Owen too, the small fist that had grabbed Gideon's shirt on the walk home that first evening, one ear always out for where his father was. "You're not going to disappear," she said, "and neither is he." She said it with the same certainty with which Gideon had said all right twice, meaning, I don't have any control over this, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway because the alternative is impossible. He looked at her. In the dim room, with Owen's breathing between them, some last defensive distance between them simply wasn't there anymore. Not gone dramatically, just quietly absent, the way a sound stops and you only notice the silence after. "Thank you," he said. "The real kind. Not the two-word, move past it kind." She nodded once. Then she went to make coffee because they were going to be up all night and they both needed it. Dr. Reeves arrived at 7 in the morning, road-dusty and businesslike, with a leather bag that clinked with glass. He examined Owen for 20 minutes, asking questions of Gideon in a rapid, efficient manner, and then came out to the front room. "Typhoid adjacent," he said. "Not classic typhoid. I've seen 3 cases in Wichita this summer with the same presentation. There's something moving through the western Kansas water supply in this heat. He needs quinine, and he needs liquid, and he needs rest." He paused. "He's going to be sick for another week at least, possibly 2. But he's not in danger as long as we manage the fever." Gideon's face did something complicated in the aftermath of those words. Not the face of a man who's been told everything is fine. The face of a man who has been told the worst is possibly not happening, and the relief and the residual fear were tangled together so completely that neither one was clean. "I'll stay another day," Dr. Reeves said to Vivian. "I need compensation for the ride, the medicine." "That's handled," Vivian said. She'd already written the figures in her head before she'd sent the rider. "Tell me what else you need." He told her. She wrote it down. Dr. Reeves went back to Owen. Gideon stood in the front room for a moment, not moving, and Vivian watched him do what people do in the aftermath of a long night of fear, the slow, messy process of letting the held breath out, which doesn't look like relief exactly, looks more like something breaking a little before it can settle. She did not give him privacy for it. That would have been wrong. She stayed where she was and let it happen in the room, and didn't look away, because looking away would have been its own kind of coldness. After a moment, he rubbed his face with both hands. "I need to go see about the forge," he said. "Practical, something to do." "The forge will be there," she said. "Sit down for 5 minutes." He sat. She handed him a cup of coffee. They sat in the front room while Dr. Reeves worked in the back, and the morning light came through the single window, and down the street someone was already starting a workday that didn't know or care what had happened here last night. "I'm going to deal with Holloway," Vivian said. He looked at her over the coffee cup. "Not—" She stopped, adjusted. "Not recklessly. Through the attorney, through the proper channels. But I have documentation now that his conduct around that reroute was fraudulent, and there are 2 other East Side business owners I've spoken to who have their own grievances, and there are avenues." "Vivian," he said. Quiet. "Even if you can prove it, men like Holloway don't go down clean." "I know. They fight. They spend money on lawyers. They call in favors." "I know," she said again. "So why?" She set her coffee down. "Because Owen is going to get better. And when he does, he's going to go back to school. And someday he's going to be a man in this county. And I want this county to be worth something to him." She paused. "And because what Holloway did to you was wrong, and it was deliberate, and it was profitable, and nobody has said so yet." Gideon was quiet for a moment. The morning light was on the side of his face, and he looked very tired and not entirely guarded, and more himself, she thought, than she'd seen him look. "You're more stubborn than you look," he said. "I'm exactly as stubborn as I look," she said. "You just didn't look long enough at first." He almost laughed, the closest she'd heard to it. Just a small thing, low in his throat, that said something had found an angle around the seriousness. She picked up her coffee again. From the back room, Owen's voice came. Thin and hoarse, but unmistakably Owen, unmistakably awake. "Dad?" Gideon was on his feet before the word finished. She heard him say from the doorway, "I'm here, bud." And then softer, "I'm right here." She sat in the front room and drank her coffee and listened to Dr. Reeves explaining something in patient, careful terms, and Owen asking a question that she couldn't quite make out, but that had Owen's particular serious child cadence, and Gideon answering, and the morning going about its unsentimental business outside the window. The receipt was in her coat pocket. It had been there for 3 weeks now. She thought about her father. about bread and a barn and a starving boy who had carried a small kindness forward through 22 years of hard living and loss, and had tried to pay it back and failed and gotten up and tried again in other ways, quieter ways, daily ones. The way he fed his son and the way he said, "all right," when he meant "I trust you," and the way he sat by the bed all night without anyone asking him to. She thought about what her father would have recognized in that. She thought about what she recognized in it. She pressed the pocket flat against her side, feeling the folded paper through the fabric. Some debts, she thought, don't work the way Wheeler's receipt had tried to make them work. Some debts aren't about money at all. Some of them are about what you do with the life that someone's small kindness helped you keep, and whether you pass it forward or let it stop with you. She knew which one her father had chosen. She knew which one Gideon had chosen. She was beginning to understand which one she was choosing. Owen recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious illness, not in a straight line, but in a jagged one. 2 good hours followed by a bad afternoon, a full night of sleep followed by a morning where the fever nudged back up, and everyone in the house held their breath until it came back down again. By the 5th day, he was sitting up and eating broth. By the 7th, he was asking questions about the hawk in the cottonwood, which Gideon took as a reliable indicator of returning personhood. By the 10th day, he was arguing about whether he was well enough to go outside, which settled the matter entirely. Dr. Reeves had left on the 3rd morning, satisfied with Owen's trajectory, and leaving behind a supply of quinine and written instructions that Gideon read 3 times and kept in his shirt pocket. Vivian came every day, not hovering, not making a production of it, just present. She brought food from her housekeeper's kitchen, sat with Owen while Gideon worked the forge for the hours he couldn't afford to lose, read aloud from a book of natural history that Owen liked because it had detailed descriptions of birds. She was not trying to be his mother. She wasn't trying to be anything in particular. She was just there, which turned out to be the thing that was needed. On the 11th day, Owen sat at the kitchen table eating actual food, eggs, bread, a cup of milk, and told Vivian with considerable authority that the hawk in the cottonwood was a Swainson's hawk, not a redtail, because Miss Pratt had shown him drawings in a book at school and he'd compared them. "I thought it might be a redtail," Vivian said. "The tail's the wrong color," Owen said. He was thin from the illness, his collarbones more visible than they should be, but his eyes were sharp again and his voice was back to its full volume. "And redtails are bigger. This one is medium. You've been very precise about this. Dad says if you're going to know something, know it right." He drank his milk. "He also says that's why he doesn't say much, because he'd rather be quiet than wrong." From the doorway, Gideon said, "I said that once." "You say it in different ways all the time," Owen said. Vivian looked at Gideon over Owen's head. Gideon had the expression of a man who has been accurately characterized by a 10-year-old, which Owen was becoming, his birthday having passed quietly during the worst of the illness, celebrated with a piece of cornbread and a carved wooden hawk that Gideon had made in the evenings while Owen slept. The carved hawk was on the table now, next to Owen's cup. Vivian had not been there for the birthday. She'd left before Gideon brought out the cornbread and the carving, not knowing it was the birthday, and Gideon hadn't told her, and she'd found out later from Owen himself, who mentioned it without guile in the middle of a conversation about something else. She'd felt something uncomfortable about missing it. She'd also felt something uncomfortable about the fact that she felt uncomfortable about missing it, which told her something about how thoroughly she'd become entangled in this household's rhythms without having made any formal decision to do so. She thought about Eleanor Marsh's words again. A woman in your situation. The implication being that her situation had defined parameters, legible to everyone in Red Bluff, and that she was operating outside them. She was, in fact, operating outside them. She'd made peace with this somewhere around the 3rd day of Owen's illness, sitting in the wooden chair beside his bed at 2 a.m. with a wet cloth and the low sound of the boy's breathing, and she'd thought, there are worse things to be accused of than this. What she hadn't made peace with entirely was the other thing, the thing that wasn't about Owen. She noticed Gideon the way you notice weather, not always consciously, but the information was always being collected. The set of his shoulders when he was worried about something versus when he was working through a problem he thought he could solve. The particular quality of his silence when he was tired versus when he was thinking. The way he looked at Owen, which was a window into everything he was. All the things he kept managed and contained in every other context, just open. She didn't know what to do with any of this. She was 53 years old and she had been married for 22 years, and she was under no illusions about the complicated interior of long human attachments. She also knew that what she felt when she walked into the forge and he looked up from the anvil was nothing she could responsibly dismiss as simple. She was thinking about this, half her attention on Owen's Hawk lecture, half somewhere else, when Gideon said from the doorway, "My attorney wrote back." She looked up. His voice had a specific quality. "About Holloway?" she said. "About the loan," he said. "Holloway's bank is calling it early." The room went quiet. "He can't do that," Vivian said immediately. "The terms of the note—" "The terms have a clause," Gideon said. He came into the kitchen and set the letter on the table. "A default clause that triggers if the property value drops below a certain ratio of the outstanding balance. Apparently they've had the Prospect Street properties assessed." He paused. "New assessment came in 30% lower than the original." "Of course it did," Vivian said. The flatness in her voice surprised even her. "Who did the assessment?" "A firm out of Dodge City," Gideon said. "One I've never heard of." She picked up the letter, read it, set it back down. Her jaw was tight. "They manufactured the conditions for the clause to trigger," she said. "The assessment is bought." "Almost certainly," he said. "But proving that takes time and money and lawyers, and the note comes due in 60 days under the early call provision." Owen had gone quiet. He was looking between them with the particular attention of a child who understands that something serious is happening and has decided that being invisible is the correct strategy. Gideon looked at Owen, looked at Vivian. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about whether I should take Holloway's offer, the North End property." "No," Vivian said. "Vivian, no." She stood up from the table, not dramatically, just couldn't sit still anymore. "That's exactly what he wants. He wants you to take the inferior deal because you're under pressure and you think you have no other options." "I might not have other options," Gideon said. "You have me," she said. It landed in the kitchen with more weight than she'd entirely intended, and both of them knew it, and Owen was very busy examining his carved hawk with intense focus. "I'm not borrowing money from you," Gideon said. His voice was level, but she could hear the thing underneath. Not pride exactly, or not only pride. Something more like principle. The specific kind of principle that a man builds over a lifetime of having nothing and having to be the one who figures it out. "I'm not offering a loan," she said. He looked at her. "I've been talking to my attorney about the Prospect Street corridor," she said. "About what it would look like if someone bought out several of the notes on those properties. Not Holloway's bank, a different institution, consolidated the debt under terms that were actually workable." She paused. "My attorney thinks it's possible. He's found 2 investors in Wichita who are interested in the east side of Red Bluff if there's reason to think the blight is temporary." "Is there reason to think it's temporary?" Gideon said. "There will be," she said. "If Holloway's manipulation of the reroute can be documented and made public, which I believe it can." She looked at him steadily. "If the reroute decision gets challenged, even if it doesn't get reversed, the scandal changes the calculation. Investors come in, property values stabilize, Holloway loses his window." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "This is a very large thing you're describing," he said. "Yes," she said. "It could fail." "Yes. And if it fails, you've spent money and credibility and made an enemy of the most powerful man in Red Bluff County." "Thomas Holloway has been my enemy since I started asking questions," she said. "He just doesn't know it yet." Owen looked up from his hawk. He said, with the directness of a child who has decided the invisible strategy is no longer necessary, "Is Mr. Holloway a bad man?" Both adults looked at him. "He does bad things," Vivian said after a moment. "That's not always the same as being a bad man, but it's close enough that the distinction doesn't help much." Owen thought about this. "Miss Pratt says you can tell a lot about a person by what they do when nobody's looking," he said. "Miss Pratt is correct," Vivian said. "Dad does things when nobody's looking," Owen said. He was still studying the hawk carving, turning it over in his hands. Good things. He thinks I'm asleep, but I see him sometimes. Gideon rubbed the back of his neck. Eat your eggs, he said to Owen. Owen ate his eggs. Bit. The letter to the Wichita land investors went out the following week. Vivian's attorney, a careful man named Theodore Marsh, no relation to Eleanor, had spent 2 weeks building the documentation package. Land records, transaction dates, the assessment comparison between the original Prospect Street valuations and Holloway's manufactured reduction. 3 sworn statements from East Side business owners detailing the sequence of pressure and decline following the reroute. A 4th statement from a former Holloway Bank employee who had left Red Bluff in 1873, and who, when Theodore tracked him down in Emporia, had turned out to have specific memory of specific conversations he was willing to put in writing. It was not, Theodore told Vivian, a bulletproof case. Holloway would have lawyers and time and resources, but it was the kind of documentation that once it existed was difficult to make disappear. And more importantly, it was the kind of documentation that investors read differently than courts did. Investors didn't need proof beyond reasonable doubt. They needed to understand whether a market was being controlled and by whom, and whether that control was likely to hold. Thomas Holloway's control of Red Bluff's East Side property was dependent on no one caring enough to look carefully at it. Someone was now looking carefully at it. That changed the arithmetic. Vivian told Gideon about the letters on a Thursday evening, the same evening of the week, she realized belatedly, as the dining hall. She'd come by after supper, partly to check on Owen and partly because the forge in the evening had a different quality than in the day, quieter, the fire banked down, the metal smell less sharp. Owen was in bed, actually asleep, not pretending, his breathing even and deep through the open door. They sat on the bench outside. It's in motion, she said. Theodore is confident, not certain, but confident. Gideon was quiet for a moment. And the 60-day call? Theodore is filing a challenge to the early call provision tomorrow. He says the assessment methodology is documentably flawed. The comparable properties Holloway's firm used were from outside the county and don't reflect local conditions. She paused. It won't stop the clock permanently, but it buys time. How much time? 90 days, maybe 100. Enough for the Wichita investors to make a decision. He nodded slowly. His hands were resting on his knees, the scarred knuckles she'd noticed months ago. Every scar on those hands had a story she probably only knew a fraction of. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. Why are you doing this? He said. Not the way he'd asked before in the forge. That had been a practical question, almost. This was different. Not the investment strategy, not the documentation. I understand all of that. He paused. I mean, why are you still here? On this bench? In this... He gestured, a small movement that encompassed the forge and the house and Owen's breathing through the door. In all of this. She looked at the dark street. A dog was moving along the far side of it, checking things with the methodical purpose of dogs everywhere. When Harold was dying, she said, I sat with him for 3 weeks. I was there every day. And there were moments, not many, but some, when he would look at me in a way that I recognized as him trying to say something that he'd never said and didn't know how to say, and ran out of time before he figured it out. She stopped. I don't know what it was. I'll never know. But I know what it looked like. It looked like a person realizing, very late, that they hadn't been entirely present for something that mattered. She looked at him. He was looking at her. I've been not entirely present for a long time, she said, inside the house. Going through the motions of a life that was mostly just management. She paused. I sat down at your table because I was angry at Margaret Holloway. And then I stayed because Owen asked me a question nobody had bothered to ask me in 20 years, and because you slid your bowl across to him and pretended you weren't hungry, and I thought... She stopped, found the honest version. I thought that's what it looks like. Being present, spending yourself on something real. The Kansas night was enormous overhead. The stars were the same extravagant number they always were. You could do that without this particular set of complications, Gideon said. Dry, but gentle underneath. I could, she said, but this is the one I walked into. He was quiet. She could feel him thinking. Not the productive thinking of someone working toward a conclusion, but the slower kind. The kind where a person is trying to figure out what they're actually willing to say. I haven't... He stopped, started again. Claire has been gone 2 years. I haven't... Another stop. You don't have to say anything, she said. I'm trying to, he said, slightly frustrated with himself in a way she found deeply human. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He exhaled, looked at the street. I'm not easy to be around, he said. I go quiet for days when things are hard. I don't ask for help well. I'm better with a hammer than with words. He paused. And my life is... It's not... Gideon, she said. He looked at her. I have a 3-story house with a chandelier from St. Louis, she said, and I've been sitting in it alone for 14 months, and I haven't liked a single day of it as much as I've liked sitting on this bench. He looked at her for a long time. Owen's going to have opinions, he said finally. Owen already has opinions about everything, she said. I find that reassuring. Something happened in his face. Not a smile exactly, not yet, but the thing that comes just before one. The relaxing of the held line, and it was the most she'd seen of him in 4 months of knowing him, and it was, in its way, more than enough. Thomas Holloway's response to Theodore Marsh's legal challenge was not long in coming. It arrived in the form of a visit, not from Holloway himself, but from his personal attorney, a man named Croft from Dodge City, who wore good boots and had the manner of someone very accustomed to making unpleasant things sound like reasonable proposals. He came to Theodore's office on a Wednesday morning, and Theodore sent word to Vivian that afternoon. She went to Theodore's office the next day. He's offering to withdraw the early call, Theodore said, and extend the loan at existing terms. For Gideon. In exchange for what? Vivian said. In exchange for you withdrawing the documentation from the Wichita investors and ceasing what he characterized as a campaign of interference in Holloway Bank's legitimate business operations. Vivian sat across from Theodore's desk and looked at the framed Kansas State Charter on the wall behind him, which she had looked at many times before and which was beginning to feel like an ironic decoration. He knows I'm behind it, she said. He knows, Theodore said. He's known for some time, I'd estimate. This is the move when a man like Holloway decides to negotiate instead of escalate. What does it mean that he's negotiating? It means he's more worried about the Wichita investors than he's letting on, Theodore said. If he were confident the documentation wouldn't move them, he'd fight. He's not fighting, he's offering you the exit. And Gideon gets the loan extension. For 1 year, Theodore said, after which presumably he'll manufacture new grounds. So the extension is worthless, Vivian said. In the long term, yes. It's a delay, not a solution. She was quiet. There's something else, Theodore said. He looked at his desk. His attorney made a separate comment, not part of the formal offer. He paused. He said that Mr. Holloway was aware that Mrs. Ashcroft had been spending considerable time at the Hale property, and that he thought it worth noting that the Ashcroft estate settlement, which still runs for another 18 months, involves certain approvals that come through the county recorder's office, which Mr. Holloway has considerable influence over. The room was very still. He's threatening the estate settlement, Vivian said. He's not threatening, Theodore said carefully. He's noting. His attorney was very precise about that word. Of course he was. She stood up and walked to the window. The main street of Red Bluff moved its ordinary Thursday business below. Wagons, people, a dog that might have been the same dog she'd watched last night. Theodore, if I withdraw, what happens to the other East Side owners, the ones who gave statements? Theodore was quiet for a moment. They're exposed, he said. Their statements are in documents that Holloway's attorney has now seen. Without the Wichita investors coming in, there's no protection. She looked at the street. And if I don't withdraw, she said. Then Holloway fights, Theodore said. He has lawyers and he has time, and he will make the estate settlement difficult, possibly very difficult. How much does difficult cost? 18 months of delays and legal fees. Theodore considered. Perhaps $12,000. Perhaps more. $12,000. Significant. Not crippling, given what Harold had left, but significant. She looked at the street for another long moment. Don't withdraw anything, she said. Vivian, he threatened the estate settlement because he doesn't have anything else, she said. If the documentation were truly harmless to him, he wouldn't be sitting in your office making notes about what word his attorney used. She turned back from the window. Send the package to Wichita. All of it. Theodore looked at her. He was a careful man and he chose his words with care. This is going to be a difficult 18 months. Yes, she said. It is. She walked back to her chair and sat down, and they spent the next 2 hours going through the documentation one more time, making sure it was as solid as they could make it. And when she left Theodore's office, the afternoon light was long and golden on the main street. She walked directly to the forge. Gideon was at the anvil, actually hammering, and she waited in the doorway until he stopped. He turned and read her face immediately. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it. The attorney's visit, the offer, the withdrawal demand, the comment about the estate settlement. He set the hammer down. He's threatening your inheritance, Gideon said. His voice was quiet and had something hard at its center. He's noting, she said with Theodore's precision. He's offering me an exit. And you're not taking it. No? He looked at her. The forge fire breathed. You should take it, he said. Gideon, I mean it. He moved toward her, not taking the distance between them quite away, but less of it than there used to be. $12,000 in legal fees over a year and a half, on top of what you've already spent, on a case that might not. It'll hold, she said. You don't know that. I believe it, she said, which is as much as anyone gets. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to know, the one that came before he said something more honest than he intended. I can't let you, he started. You can't stop me, she said simply. Not unkindly. I've thought about this. The documentation exists. The statements exist. If I withdraw, the people who trusted me with those statements are unprotected, and Holloway wins, and he does the same thing to the next town, or the next block, or the next man with a forge and a loan coming due. She paused. I'm not withdrawing. The line of his jaw. The thing in his eyes that wasn't quite anger but was related to it. The specific anger of a man who has been protected by someone when he thought he was the one who was supposed to do the protecting and doesn't know how to hold that without it costing him something. This is not what you signed up for, he said, when you sat down at that table. I know, she said. You came for a cracked wheel rim and dinner. And I stayed for considerably more, she said. That's generally how it works. He looked at her. She looked at him. The forge fire made its sound. What do you want from this? He said. Quiet. Direct. The question he'd been working toward for a while. She answered it the same way she'd learned to answer him, without decorating it, without managing it into something safer. I want the East Side properties to stabilize, she said. I want Owen to grow up in a town that isn't quietly owned by one man's greed. I want the school that doesn't exist yet, and the medical clinic that should have been here before Dr. Mercer left. She paused. And I want to sit on that bench in the evening and not have to manage what I'm feeling when I do it. He was very still. That's a long list, he said. I'm a thorough person, she said. Something in him that had been held very carefully for a very long time shifted. She could see it, not breaking, nothing that dramatic, just shifting, the way a load redistributes when a second person reaches up to help carry it. He crossed the remaining distance between them, and he put both hands on either side of her face and he kissed her, which was not smooth and not planned, and was over in about 4 seconds before he stepped back with the look of a man who has done the thing he needed to do and is now fully prepared to be accountable for it. Owen is going to have a great deal to say about this, he said. Owen already knows, she said. He's been knows for weeks. He's just been waiting for us to catch up. Gideon made the sound again. Low in his throat, real this time, an actual laugh, surprised out of him. Outside, the Kansas evening was doing what it always did, going on with its indifferent, enormous business. And inside the forge, the fire was banking down for the night, and the hammer was at rest on the anvil. And in the house next door, Owen Hale slept the solid sleep of a boy who had survived his fever and expected, with the complete confidence of someone who has good reasons for it, that everything was going to be all right. He wasn't wrong. The Wichita investors responded 6 weeks after Theodore sent the package. There were two of them, a land developer named Samuel Price and a businessman named Ira Kellner, who had made his money in grain transport and was, according to Theodore, the kind of man who read documentation carefully and made decisions quickly once he understood what he was reading. They came to Red Bluff on a Tuesday in October, when the heat had finally broken and the Kansas air had the particular clean quality that arrives in fall, like an apology for summer. They spent one day walking the East Side corridor, looking at the forge, the shuttered Cooper's shop, the building that had been a feed store and was now empty, the Prospect Street lots that Holloway had been waiting to acquire at collapsed prices. They did not meet with Thomas Holloway. This was noted by several people in town. They met with Theodore for 3 hours. Then they met with Vivian for 2. Then Price walked the corridor again alone in the late afternoon, and Vivian watched from across the street as he stood in front of the forge for a long time, looking at it with the evaluative stillness of someone pricing what he's looking at. She crossed the street. "The forge has been operational for 11 years, she said. "The smith knows his work. The location serves the eastern ranches and the road traffic that would return if the corridor stabilized." Price looked at her sideways. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, deliberate in his movements, the kind of man who had learned that quick conclusions were expensive. "The reroute damage is real," he said. "Even if Holloway's conduct is proven, you can't put that traffic back overnight." "No," she said, "but you can build something that doesn't depend on waiting for the traffic to return on its own." She paused. "There's no school on this side of town. There's no doctor. The families who live and work out here have to come all the way to Main Street for both, and most of them don't, because they can't afford the time." She looked at the street. "If you put a school here and a medical clinic here, you give people a reason to settle on this side of town instead of the other. You build the demand instead of waiting for it." Price looked at her. "That's a philanthropic argument, not an investment argument." "It's both," she said. "People follow services. Services generate commerce. Commerce generates property value." She met his eyes. "And yes, it's also the right thing to do, which I don't think needs to be in conflict with the numbers." He was quiet for a moment. "Kellner said you were going to say something like that. What did Kellner say about it?" "He said he agreed with you." Price looked back at the forge. "He's easier to convince than I am, but I'm not unconvinced." The decision came 4 days later, in a letter to Theodore. Price and Kellner would purchase the 4 most distressed Prospect Street notes from Holloway's bank at assessed value, which, given the manufactured assessment, was low enough that Holloway could not reasonably refuse without drawing further attention to the assessment process, and restructure them under a new instrument with extended terms and a fixed rate that the East Side business owners could actually service. It was not a rescue. It was a restructuring, which is a more dignified and more sustainable thing. The businesses still had to work. The loans still had to be repaid. But the 60-day gun that Holloway had been holding to Gideon's head was gone. And in its place was a term of 5 years at terms that a working forge in a stabilizing corridor could meet. Theodore brought the letter to Vivian on a Thursday morning, and she read it at the study desk and then sat for a while looking at the window. She thought about what Price had said. "That's a philanthropic argument, not an investment argument," as if those were necessarily different things. As if money spent making a place worth living in wasn't money that came back in ways the ledger didn't always capture, but that were real nonetheless. Harold had never seen it that way. Harold had been a man of the ledger, careful and correct in his accounting, and genuinely blind to the columns that didn't show up in it. She hadn't always seen it differently herself. It had taken a dining hall and a bowl of stew and a 7-year-old's direct question to reorder her understanding of what the columns were actually for. She went to the forge. Gideon was inside, at the workbench, not the anvil. He had a piece of iron in a small vise and was filing it with the patient, precise attention he gave to detailed work. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face. He was not a man who showed things easily on his face. She knew that by now, had learned to read the smaller signals, the slight release around his eyes, the breath that came out differently than the one that went in. He read it twice. Then he set it on the bench. "Price and Kellner," he said. "They walked the corridor themselves," she said. "They wanted to see it." And Holloway sold the notes. "He didn't have a clean way to refuse," she said. "The assessment documentation is in Wichita now. If he'd refused to sell at assessed value, it would have raised questions about why a bank considers notes more valuable than its own commissioned assessment says they are." Gideon looked at the letter again. "He's not going to let this sit." "No," she said. "He'll look for another angle. He always does." She paused. "But we have time now, real time." He was quiet for a moment. "How much did this cost you?" he said. Not the money. She'd told him the figures weeks ago, and he'd absorbed them with the specific grimness of a man keeping honest track of a debt he couldn't yet pay. He meant the other cost. The 18 months of estate complications that Holloway's attorney had promised. "Theodore filed an objection to the recorder's delay last week," she said. "It'll slow things down. Holloway still has influence there." "I know," he said. "How much?" She looked at him. "It's manageable." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer I have right now," she said. "Ask me again in 6 months." He picked up the file and turned it over in his hands, not resuming work, just having something to do with his hands while he thought. "I want to pay it back," he said. "I know I can't yet, but I want to." "Gideon?" "Not a statement about what you should expect," he said. "Just a statement about what I intend." He looked at her. "I don't want you to have spent this on me and not know that I know what it is." She understood. It was important to him that the accounting be clear, not for her sake, but for his, because a man who has lived by his own accounting for his whole life needs to know where things stand. "I know you know," she said. He nodded once, set the file down. "Owen told me this morning," he said, "that he wants to be a teacher." She blinked. The shift in subject was so Gideon, the pivot to Owen when the other conversation had gotten to its limit, but she let it happen. "When did he decide this?" "Apparently Miss Pratt told him he explained things well," Gideon said. "He's been thinking about it since." He paused. "He said he wants to teach on the east side, here, where the kids don't have to walk all the way to Main Street." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "He's going to need a school," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "He is." Well, the school was not a fast thing. Nothing real is. Vivian began the process in November, when the first of the investor money had stabilized enough that she could move a portion of her own funds towards something that would not show a return for years, and was fine with that. She bought the empty lot 2 blocks south of the Forge, the one that had belonged to the shuttered Cooper's shop, that everyone in town had been walking past for 18 months like it was already a ruin. She hired a builder named Ashby, who worked out of a town 20 miles east because she didn't want Holloway's people knowing the scope of the project before the foundation was in. She designed the school with the builder over a series of meetings that Gideon sat in on, not because she asked him to, but because he showed up to the second one and turned out to have specific opinions about structural timber that Ashby took seriously. "You know building," Vivian said after the second meeting. "I know materials," Gideon said. "Ironwork is ironwork. Wood has different rules, but the principle of load is the same." Owen came to the third meeting and sat in the corner and drew a picture of what he thought the school should look like from the outside, with a large window on the east side for morning light, which he presented to Ashby with the solemnity of a professional delivering a specification. Ashby looked at the drawing. "Big window," he said. "Kids learn better with light," Owen said. "Miss Pratt said so." Ashby glanced at Vivian. She kept her expression neutral. "I'll see what I can do," Ashby said. The east window was in the final plans. Construction started in March of 1875 when the ground was workable. By June, the frame was up and half the county had driven by to look at it, because in Red Bluff a new building was an event, and this one was going up on a block that most people had written off. Vivian had not announced what it was, just filed the permit and let the frame speak for itself, which it did, and which generated exactly the kind of curiosity that she'd decided was more useful than an announcement would have been. Thomas Holloway came to see her about it in April, not his attorney, himself. He came to the Ashcroft house on a Wednesday afternoon, and Vivian's housekeeper showed him to the parlor, and Vivian came in and sat down and offered him coffee with the same level of courtesy she'd offer anyone, which was to say, adequate and nothing more. He was a man in his early 60s, well-fed, well-dressed, with the steady confidence of someone who had rarely been in a room where he wasn't the most powerful person. He looked around the Ashcroft parlor as if assessing it, which she suspected was habit. "I want to talk about the Prospect Street situation," he said. "All right," she said. "The notes that Price and Kellner bought," he said. "I'd like to repurchase them, at a premium, 10% above the Wichita price." She looked at him. "That's not something I control," she said. "You'd need to speak to Price and Kellner directly." "I've spoken to them," he said. "They deferred to your position." So, they'd made her the decision point. She was not surprised. "Then my position is no," she said. He looked at her with the particular quality of a man recalibrating. Not angry, not yet, calculating. "You're building a school," he said. "I am. On the East Corridor. 2 blocks south of Prospect Street, yes." "That's a significant investment in a depressed area," he said. "It's a risk." "Most things worth doing are," she said. He set his coffee cup down. "Mrs. Ashcroft." He said her name in the tone of a man who has decided to be direct because the alternatives haven't worked. "You are a widow with a complicated estate and a set of investments that require stable relationships with the financial institutions in this county. I have considerable influence over those relationships. I want you to understand that clearly." "I understand it perfectly," she said. "Then you understand that this course of action, Mr. Holloway," she said. Her voice was even, entirely even. She'd practiced this steadiness over 40 years of managing difficult rooms. "I have documentation of your conduct around the 1873 railroad reroute that is currently in the possession of my Wichita attorney, 2 land investors, and a separate attorney I retained in Topeka last month." She paused. "If anything happens to my estate settlement beyond normal administrative delay, that documentation becomes a matter of public record. All of it, including the purchased assessment and the shell companies and the former bank employee's statement." She looked at him. "I want you to understand that clearly." The parlor was very quiet. Thomas Holloway looked at her for a long time. The calculation in his face was visible. She'd rarely seen the calculation so visible in a man who usually kept it better concealed. He was weighing things. She could practically hear the weight. "You've been busy," he said finally. "I have," she said. "Would you like more coffee?" He stood. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ashcroft." "Good afternoon," she said. He left. She sat in the parlor for a while after he'd gone, not moving, with the careful stillness of someone who has walked across a narrow thing and reached the other side and needs a moment before they start telling themselves it was fine. Her hands, when she looked at them, were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against her knees until they were. The school opened in September of 1875, 14 months after Owen's fever broke and the frame came down on the east side of Red Bluff. Vivian stood inside it on the morning before the first day and looked at the east window, which was large and filled the whole classroom with morning light exactly the way Owen had intended, and felt something she couldn't name precisely. Not pride, because pride implies ownership, and this wasn't hers to own. More like the feeling of having carried something to its right place and being able to put it down. Miss Pratt transferred from the Main Street School to teach here. She did it voluntarily, which Vivian had been quietly hoping for but hadn't asked for, because some things you can't ask for directly, you can only create the conditions where they become possible. 12 children enrolled the first week, 22 by the end of the month. Owen Hale was not among them. He was still at Miss Pratt's old school, being 10 years old and acquiring the education that he was going to need for what came next. But he came to see the new building on a Saturday, walking through the empty classroom with his hands in his pockets and his head turning to take in the east window, the chalkboard, the benches that Gideon had built over 3 evenings in the forge and installed himself. "It's good," Owen said. "You think so?" Vivian said. "The window is right," he said, "and the benches are the right height. Sometimes benches are too tall and little kids can't put their feet down." He paused. "I checked." She looked at him. He was tall for 10, with Gideon's dark hair and Clara's eyes, which she knew from the one small portrait Gideon kept on the mantelpiece. He had a directness that was entirely his own. "What made you want to be a teacher?" she said. He thought about it. "Someone has to explain things to people," he said. "And I'm pretty good at explaining things. Dad says I explain things even when nobody asked." He paused. "But Miss Pratt says that's actually a skill if you learn to aim it right." "Miss Pratt is correct," Vivian said. He looked at the east window again. "Will there be a clinic?" he said. "You said there might be." "Next year," she said. "We're working on it." "There wasn't a doctor when I got sick," he said. It was not an accusation, just a fact, stated with Owen's particular flatness that made facts feel more like facts than they did when adults said them. "That was bad." "It was," she said. "That's why there's going to be a clinic." He nodded. Matters settled. He went to examine the chalkboard. Gideon found them there 20 minutes later. He'd come from the forge, still in his work clothes, and he stood in the doorway of the school he'd helped build with his hands, and looked at the room with an expression that Vivian didn't try to read, just let be. "It looks right," he said. "Owen approved the window," she said. "I know," Gideon said. "He's been telling me about the window for 3 months." Owen, at the chalkboard, wrote his name in large letters with a piece of chalk he'd found on the ledge, examined it, and then wrote Hale East School underneath in slightly smaller letters. "It doesn't have a name yet," Vivian said. "It does now," Owen said. Gideon looked at Vivian. She looked at Gideon. Neither of them corrected the boy. They were married in the spring of 1876, which was later than some people expected and earlier than others thought wise and exactly when it was right for both of them, which was the only timing that mattered. The ceremony was small. Theodore Marsh as witness, Miss Pratt, 2 of the East Side business owners who had become something like friends over the preceding year, and Owen, who wore his best clothes and had combed his hair with an attention to detail that he normally reserved for the hawk in the cottonwood. Vivian did not move into the Ashcroft house with Gideon. Instead, she moved into the house beside the forge, the small one, and the Ashcroft house was put to different use. One wing converted to temporary housing for families passing through with nowhere to stay, another to a meeting room that the East Side community began using for everything from school board discussions to medical consultations when Dr. Ellis arrived. Dr. Ellis came in the fall of 1876. Young, 29 years old, recently qualified from a family in Missouri that had more children than money and had paid for his education through a combination of scholarship and stubborn collective sacrifice. He was the kind of doctor who would visit people at home when they couldn't get to the clinic, which he did regularly, which meant he was chronically overworked and consistently underpaid and entirely in the right place. Gideon built the clinic frame. Price and Kellner put in money. Vivian coordinated everything, which meant she spent a great deal of time in rooms with men who were not accustomed to taking direction from a woman and had to be managed into it gradually, which she had by now extensive practice at. The clinic opened in November of 1876. It was smaller than Vivian would have liked, and better than nothing by a margin that Dr. Ellis said, on the first morning, was significant. She trusted him on this. He'd seen the margin from both sides. Thomas Holloway did not attend either opening. He had, over the preceding year, gone quieter. Not gone. He was still in Red Bluff, still running the bank, still the man with the most property and the most influence. But the documentation in Wichita and Topeka was real, and he knew it was real, and the particular game he'd been playing on the East Side had been made visible, and visible games are harder to play than invisible ones. He was not finished, and Vivian knew better than to think he was finished. but he was contained for now. And containment was what they had, and what they were working with. What Vivian understood about men like Holloway, and it had taken her time to understand it, because she'd spent years in Harold's world where these men were the furniture, the assumed background of every room, was that they depended on other people's smallness. They needed people to believe that the range of what was possible was exactly as wide as the powerful wanted it to be, no wider. The moment someone demonstrated that the range was wider, the whole mechanism lost something it couldn't get back. She had demonstrated it. Gideon had been demonstrating it every day for 11 years by simply not leaving, not folding, not accepting Holloway's version of what was possible for a man like him. The difference was that now they were demonstrating it together, which was harder to ignore than either of them alone. Owen Hale became a teacher in 1886, when he was 19 years old, and the Hale East School had expanded twice and had a second room and 41 enrolled students. He did not take the position because it was convenient or because it was his only option. He took it because he'd spent the 9 years since the school opened watching what learning did to children who hadn't had reliable access to it, and he wanted to be part of that. And he was good at it, and he knew he was good at it with the same unself-conscious certainty with which he'd always known the hawk in the cottonwood was a Swainson's and not a red tail. He was not a perfect teacher. He had Gideon's occasional impatience with people who wouldn't engage, and he had a tendency to teach to the curious kids at the expense of the ones who needed more repetition. He worked on this. He asked Miss Pratt, who was still teaching in the first room, to tell him when he was doing it, and she did, and he adjusted because Owen Hale had learned from both his parents, the father who was present and the mother who lived in a portrait and a song, that adjustment is not defeat, it's just the next piece of the work. He was, in the way that matters, exactly what his father had been building toward without knowing he was building toward it, a person who passed things forward. On an evening in the fall of 1886, Vivian sat on the porch of the house beside the forge, their house, hers and Gideon's, the small one that had become entirely itself over the years, that had been repaired and added to and was none of the things that the Ashcroft house was, but was in every way she could measure more like home, and watched the light go amber over the Kansas plain. Gideon came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair. He moved differently than he had 12 years ago. The left shoulder that he'd injured in a forge accident 3 years prior hadn't entirely healed, and he carried it carefully. He was 60 now. He looked it, and he didn't, in equal measure. Owen taught the Merrill boy to read today, Vivian said. He told me at supper. Billy Merrill? Gideon said. That kid is 9 years old and stubborn as a fence post. Apparently Owen tried 17 different approaches before the 18th one worked, she said. Gideon looked at her. He counted? He counted, she said. He wrote them all down. Gideon shook his head, but not in the way you shake your head at something that bothers you, in the way you shake your head at something that surprises you with how right it is. They sat with their coffee and the light moved, and from somewhere down the east corridor came the sound of the town doing what it did now, which was different from what it had done in 1874 in ways both large and small. The forge was still there, still working, with 2 younger men alongside Gideon now, who'd apprenticed with him over the years. The school's second room had been talking about a third. Dr. Ellis had trained a nurse, a woman named Caridad, who had come up from Texas and who had, in Vivian's estimation, approximately 3 times his diagnostic instinct and 1/5 the social authority, which she was gradually correcting. The Ashcroft house had sheltered 40-something families over the years in its converted wing. She'd kept a rough count until about the 30th family and then stopped, not because she'd lost interest, but because the count had started to feel like a different kind of accounting than the one she was doing. The receipt from 1861 was in the top drawer of the writing desk inside. She'd put it there the year they'd married, and it had stayed there, which was where it belonged. Not destroyed because it was the record of something real, but not carried anymore either because the debt it represented had been transformed into something that didn't fit on paper. I've been thinking, Gideon said. About what? About that boy in Indiana, he said. The one who slept in your father's barn. She looked at him. He was looking at the plane. If your mother hadn't packed that cloth, he said, the cornbread and the dried meat. He stopped. I think about that sometimes. How small a thing it was. How absolutely I would not be here without it. You'd be somewhere, she said. You're hard to stop. Maybe, he said, but not here. He looked at the east corridor. The school, the clinic, the forge, the street that had come back. Not any of this. She looked at it too. The amber light on the buildings, the smoke from the clinic's chimney where Dr. Ellis kept the stove going for patients who came in cold. The school windows dark now, the students long since home. My mother didn't think about the bread, Vivian said. She just gave it. She probably didn't think about it again. I know, he said. That's the thing about it. She understood what he meant. The thing about kindness that isn't performed, isn't accounted for, isn't given with one eye on the return. The thing about that kind of kindness is that the person who gives it doesn't know what they're giving. They're just a woman packing a cloth for a starving boy because he's there and he's hungry and she has bread. They don't know they're feeding something that's going to spend the next 50 years propagating forward, becoming other things, becoming a forge and a school and a clinic and a marriage and a boy who counted 17 failed approaches before the 18th one worked. What do you think she'd say? Vivian said. My mother, if she could see. Gideon thought about it. He had the habit still of taking real time with questions that deserved it. She'd probably say she just gave him bread, he said. Vivian almost laughed. Yes, she said. She would. She picked up her coffee. The evening was going on with its business, indifferent and enormous and full of the particular quiet that comes to a place where people have been working hard and have, for this moment, stopped. The hawk, or its descendants, because no single hawk lasts decades, had been gone from the cottonwood for years. Owen had noted its absence the season it happened, recorded it in the small natural history notebook he'd been keeping since he was 8, and moved on to the next observation. That was the thing about Owen. He noticed everything and released nothing important and carried forward what he'd been given in whatever form he could find for it. He had done this since he was 7 years old, swinging his legs under the dining hall bench, asking questions that nobody else thought to ask. Gideon set his cup down on the armrest. He reached over without looking and took her hand, the way people do after long enough together that the gesture has stopped requiring decision. Just a hand finding another hand in the early dark. She thought about the dining hall, the back table, the thin stew, the precise small movement of a man sliding his food to his son while pretending he wasn't hungry. How she'd watched it through the doorway before Margaret Holloway opened her mouth and made everything happen. She'd sat down at that table thinking she was angry at a woman who was lying about a dinner reservation. She'd stayed because a boy asked her a question. She'd come back because the question hadn't let her go. Do you like it? The big house. The one with the chandelier, the life that looked from outside like everything. She had her answer now, not the big house. This one, small and imperfect and stocked with Gideon's various projects and Owen's books and the clay hawk that a 10-year-old had made in school and presented to Vivian with the same seriousness he brought to everything, which now sat on the windowsill in the kitchen and looked out at the east corridor with its painted yellow beak. Did she like it? She liked it the way she liked the bench in the evening and the coffee before the forge got hot, and the sound of Gideon's hammer carrying down the street on the days when work was good. She liked it the way she liked the argument they'd had last spring about whether the clinic needed a larger storeroom, which it did, and which she'd been right about, which he'd eventually admitted on a Thursday over supper 3 weeks after the argument, the way he admitted things, quietly and completely and without fanfare. She liked it the way you like a thing that cost you something real to have. She held his hand in the early dark, and the Kansas plane did its silent, enormous thing beyond the porch and somewhere in the school down the street. On the chalkboard in the east-facing room, Owen's name was probably still written, the way it had been since the first morning. Under the words he'd chalked up with the certainty of a boy who understood, even at 10, that naming things is how you begin to make them last. She hadn't erased it. She'd asked the building's caretaker not to. He'd given her a slightly puzzled look and said, "All right." It was still there. It would be there in the morning. It was, as far as Vivian Ashcroft Hale was concerned, enough. More than enough. The exact right amount of everything, which is a thing that most people spend their whole lives searching for, and some few are lucky enough, stubborn enough, and willing enough to build with their own hands from the wreckage of what almost wasn't. The night came in gently over Red Bluff. The lamp in the window made its small, steady light, and on the porch of a house that had started as someone else's and become entirely theirs, two people who had found each other late and imperfectly and without any guarantee of outcome sat together in the ordinary, irreplaceable quiet of a life that was exactly where it was supposed to be.